Today I've got a book with me which is called The Book of Indian Kings, and it tells you the stories of many Indian kings, most of whom lived and ruled in medieval India. So the story of King Ashoka, of Tipu Sultan, of Ranjit Singh, of Shivaji, these stories you'll find in the book. The book is a collection of essays written by different writers, very prominent writers. So it gives a nice flavor of history, Indian history in particular. And you travel from one part of history, from one era to another, which is another interesting thing. So today I'm going to narrate here the first essay in this book, which is called The Emergence of Empire Mauryan India. It is written by Romila Thapar, who is a historian, and of course, as you know, it is about the Mauryan Empire, and the most prominent king among the Mauryans was King Ashoka. So, without any delay, let me start. At the time of Bindusara's death in 272 BC, a large part of the subcontinent had come under Mauryan suzerainty. One area that was hostile, possibly interfering with Mauryan commerce to the peninsula and South India, was Kalinga on the east coast, which is Orissa today. Its conquest was left to Bindusara's son Ashoka, whose campaign in Kalinga was more than just an event of military significance. Until about 100 years ago in India, Ashoka was merely one of the many kings mentioned in the Mauryan dynastic list included in the Puranas. Elsewhere in the Buddhist tradition, he was referred to as Chakravartin or Chakravati, a universal monarch, but this tradition had become extinct in India after the decline of Buddhism. However, in 1837, James Prinsep deciphered an inscription written in the earliest Indian script since the Harappan Brahmi script. There were many inscriptions in which the king referred to himself as Devanam Piyadasi, that is, the beloved of the gods Piyadasi. The name did not tally with any mentioned in the dynastic lists, although it was mentioned in the Buddhist chronicles of Sri Lanka. Slowly, the clues were put together, but the final confirmation came in 1915 with the discovery of yet another version of the edicts in which the king calls himself Devanampiya Ashoka. The edicts of Ashoka, located as inscriptions in various parts of his empire, acquaint us not only with the personality of the king, but also with the events of his reign and, above all, his policies as a ruler. As statements of his personal concerns, they are remarkable documents, vividly capturing the ambience of his time. This allows glimpses of something other than the conventional limitations of official documents. The edicts do in fact speak of his concerns, both as a human being and as a statesman. Their almost conversational style brings to life the personality of the king. The edicts of the earlier half of his reign were inscribed on rock surfaces wherever these were conveniently located, and are therefore referred to as the minor and major rock edicts. These were distributed widely throughout the empire, especially in areas of permanent settlement and concentrations of people. In the latter part of his reign, his edicts were inscribed on well-polished sandstone monolithic pillars, each surmounted with a finely sculpted animal capital, and these have come to be known as pillar edicts. The stone was quarried from sites at Chunar near Varanasi and would have involved much technological expertise in cutting and engraving. The pillar edicts are confined to the Ganges plain, probably because they were transported by river. The area coincides with the heartland of the empire. Ashokan inscriptions continue to be found, and there is always anticipation regarding information that a new edict may bring. Even where the text is the same as that of earlier ones, the significance of the location adds to our information on Mauryan history. Translations or versions in Greek or Aramaic or any other language of the Ashokan edicts intended for the Greek and Aramaic speaking people on the northwestern borders have been helpful in clarifying the meaning of those Prakrit terms that are ambiguous or controversial. Thus, Dhamma was rendered by some scholars as the teaching of the Buddha and by others as a more general concern for ethical behavior. Its translation into Greek as Eusebia would tend to support the second meaning. There is, interestingly, no reference to the teachings of the Buddha in the Greek and Aramaic versions. This might have been expected if their intention was to propagate Buddhism. What is equally fascinating is that some concepts in these edicts are drawn from the philosophical discourse in that language. Thus, the edicts in Aramaic are better understood if read in the context of some Zoroastrian concepts. At a more mundane level, the Greek version of the Minor Rock Edict clarifies the date as being in expired regnal years, which is helpful to chronological reconstruction. Ashoka's experience as an administrator began with his being the governor at Taxila and at Ujjain, both cities handling commercial activities. His sojourn in Taxila is described in texts associated with the latter northern Buddhist tradition. These write of his bid for the throne on the deathbed of his father, a bid encouraged by some of the more powerful ministers. His stay at Ujjain is described in the Sri Lankan chronicles of the southern Buddhist tradition. They refer to his love for the beautiful daughter of a merchant, a devout Buddhist, and the mother of his son Mahinda, who is said to have introduced Buddhism to Sri Lanka. There continues to be a controversy as to whether Ashoka succeeded his father immediately on the latter's death, or whether there was a 4-year interregnum involving a struggle for the throne among the brothers. Of the events of Ashoka's reign, the most frequently referred to by modern historians has been his conversion to Buddhism. This was linked to the famous campaign in Kalinga. In about 260 BC, Ashoka campaigned against the Kalingans and routed them. Presumably, the campaign was to obtain resources from Kalinga, to safeguard the routes of the profitable Mauryan trade with the peninsula that went past the eastern coast, or to chastise the Kalingans for having broken away from Magadhan control. If the canal built by the Nandas was a symbol of control. The destruction caused by the war filled the king with remorse. His earlier perfunctory interest in Buddhist teaching was rekindled, and this time it became a central pursuit. It has been stated in the past that he was dramatically converted to Buddhism immediately after the battle with its attendant horrors. But his was not an overnight conversion. He states in one of his inscriptions that only after a period of 2.5 years did he become a zealous devotee of Buddhism. It eventually led him to endorse non-violence and consequently forswear war as means of conquest. Yet, curiously, he refrained from engraving his confession of remorse at any location in Kalinga. This was replaced by the separate edicts, which are instructions to his officers emphasizing the need for good administration. Nevertheless, his statement on the campaign is indeed extraordinary, coming from a conqueror, setting him apart as a rare human being. He states, "When he had been consecrated 8 years, the beloved of the gods, the king Piyadasi conquered Kalinga. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. Afterwards, now that Kalinga was annexed, the beloved of the gods very earnestly practiced Dhamma, desired Dhamma, and taught Dhamma. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse. For when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods and weighs heavily on his mind. What is even more deplorable to the beloved of the gods is that those who dwell there, whether Brahmins, Shramans, or those of other sects or householders, who show obedience to their superiors, obedience to mother and father, obedience to their teachers, and behave well and devotedly toward their friends, acquaintances, colleagues, relatives, slaves, and servants, all suffer violence, murder, and separation from their loved ones. Even those who are fortunate to have escaped and whose love is undiminished suffer from the misfortunes of their friends, acquaintances, colleagues, and relatives. This participation of all men in suffering weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods.